Hi, everybody. We are going to start in a minute to give people the chance to log in. Feel free to use the chat box to say hello, introduce yourself, tell us where you're at and what firm you work at. All right, we're going to get started here. Welcome, everybody. I'm Lauren Oglesby. I'm the Content Communication and Programs Coordinator at AIA New Orleans. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar. This is the 7th in our series, Storytelling with Architects. And today we're very excited to hear from celebrated local architect Trey Trahan. A heads up about the format up top here. All attendees will be muted, but you will be able to ask questions either through the chat box or through the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. And we welcome questions, so don't be shy. We will be making a recording of this webinar available afterwards on our YouTube channel, and just to note that it will exist purely as a resource for this and all of our webinars. You do have to attend the webinar live as it happens to gain an LU. And lastly, we're a small team and we don't really have capacity to troubleshoot or answer IT questions during the webinar. You should have gotten an email with a backup call-in number. So if you're running into internet difficulties, please try the call-in number. And if you do call in via telephone, just send your name and AIA number to me, Lauren at aianeworleans.org, so that I can make sure to get you credit. Here's our agenda for today. We just covered the guidelines and etiquette section, so I'm going to introduce you to Trey Trahan right now. With a strong investment in the social mission of architecture, Trey's work is oriented towards inclusive design, environmental values, and creating venues of opportunity for powerful communal experiences. Trey is commended for his innovative use of sustainable materials stemming from his strong personal belief in the value of environmental conservancy. From 2015 to 2017, Trey served as a member of the International Council of the Van Allen Institute in New York, an organization that explores how design can transform cities and landscapes to improve people's lives. He's currently a board member of the Cultural Landscape Foundation in Washington, D.C., a nonprofit that educates and engages the public in our shared historical landscapes. An avid art collector, Trey lends his various and unique pieces and collections to museums and exhibits globally. Trey resides in New Orleans, Louisiana, and Patagonia, Chile. Welcome, Trey. Thank you so much. And Trey will be joined in conversation here by Julie Babin, who is the president-elect of AIA New Orleans. Welcome.
Thank you, Lauren. It's nice to be here.
Hey, thank you so much. I think we met last year briefly during the Baltimore Design Jury and had a great time getting to know you a little bit, and really looking forward to learning more about your practice today. I thought I'd start with just a big picture question, just simply, what do you love most about architecture?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you, Julie. You know, I think I love how committed most architects are and how much we care about the quality of life and those types of issues. We're really reminded of that these days with all that we're dealing with the pandemic and issues of equality. And so, you know, it's a constant learning process, right? It's about unearthing what is unique to the problem we're solving, whether it's place or people, but truly rooting the project in those issues, arriving at a place, hopefully, that it's an incredibly authentic response. I've also been fascinated by the uniqueness of clients and our role as architects of not in a parental way, but in a collegial way, creating a more informed client about what architects do and the impact we can have on communities and our process for creating. It's always intrigued me, and the older I get, we kind of expand those influences.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting to talk about the client, because they really are sort of like an extension of the design team in a lot of ways, and they do really have a big impact on projects and just sort of the experience overall. I'm curious, what's been your biggest lesson as a design and business leader over the last decade or so?
Yeah, I think I used to think of projects distinctly separate in an isolated silo. But the older I get, the more the typologies become diverse, how each project can not only contribute to a much richer process that you bring to each process, but that the larger projects for us, for example, if the profitability is significantly higher than the smaller projects, you can use those assets, that capital to invest in the smaller projects. And that's quite frankly what we do. We use some of that money to invest in the smaller projects. Because let's face it, at times there are projects that you would love to work on and you're successful in being selected, but the fee doesn't necessarily cover what you would like to achieve. And so we'll do that. And the hope there is that we'll create something that's really unique and beautiful, and responsible for the client group, but also that impacts a much broader architectural profession, and contributes once again to the practice. And so we enjoy that. We enjoy thinking about how our problem solving has a much longer trajectory to it than the immediacy of that project.
What is one of those smaller projects that you're referencing? What would be like an example of that? Is that like a single family residence, or is it a community project?
Yeah, well, right now we were recently selected for two projects. One locally is the Loyola University Chapel. And so it's a small 7,000 square foot chapel. And some of our earliest work was sacred spaces. And quite frankly, I didn't realize this too many years later. The Vatican II documents of the Catholic Church has really influenced our process, the way we think about arrival and the processional aspect, and space, and kind of an editing of space, and so a purity of space, but it's at the same time atmosphere and complexity in that purity. And so the larger projects help them with those. A more national project is the National Arboretum in Washington, D.C. We're working on 5 buildings there: the North American Bonsai Pavilion, the Chinese Bonsai Pavilion, and the Japanese Bonsai Pavilion. And so, yeah, these projects are really complementary to the practice.
And what about where we find ourselves right now in the last several months? What's been sort of your biggest lesson in leading your team through this pandemic?
Yeah, I think we were somewhat on this trajectory pre-pandemic, but I think it's kind of elevated the way we think about architecture. At this point, I feel like we have assembled an extremely talented team with great experience. And so it liberates me to think about things that are peripheral to architecture, but tremendously impactful, and that is, more humanitarian issues and how we define beauty. I almost apologetically look back and think about how I so often define beauty as not just the physicality of things, of artifacts and space and buildings, but we've really expanded that definition in the office to include ethics and humility. And so, that coupled with, I guess, directly my response would be, I'm amazed at how quickly society has pivoted right against this common enemy. I know it seems like years, but I think as a world, we've pivoted quickly, and I'm hopeful that that experience for society will lead us to a place where we realize we can pivot quickly to other issues that we're confronting. For me personally, one of those issues is climate change, and can we pivot quickly to alter the way we live? That said, I'm really encouraged and believe that there's kind of a rebalancing taking place between our professional and personal lives, and hope we move to privileging family and communities much more. And I don't think that has to be at the expense of our practice.
Yeah, that's great. As the president-elect of the AIA, the current president, Terry Dreyer, has had a real big push for the 2030 challenge, and trying to get as many firms in New Orleans and Louisiana signed up for that. And there's some programming happening in the fall around that, and I hope to continue that through next year, because as you know, in many ways, we're always kind of behind the times here, and sort of building some movement, locally to adapt more to those challenges that we're all facing.
Yeah, that's exciting.
How do you see your role as a leader in relationship to your staff? What is your role to them?
Yeah, I think that goes back to the previous comment about expanding what influences our work. Maybe in some ways redefining beauty, thinking about process of making. The image up right now is I've met a number of Japanese artists. I enjoy the Japanese culture and their artwork. This is a Tibo by the renowned Japanese artist Shiro Tsuchimura. He lives in Nara, Japan, which is about a little over an hour train ride outside of Kyoto. He lives in a heavily forested area. And I think the beauty here is he retrieves clay from his mountain site, and he shapes beautifully the clay into these vessels. These vessels are, he has, I think, a half dozen of these in the Met, about the same number in the MFA Boston and the Smithsonian. But the beauty is not only embedded in the way his hands shape the clay, but his placement of these in a kiln that's embedded in the earth, and the excitement he gets when he opens the kiln door and finds that what is retrieved has been elevated to a far greater level. And that speaks to me, because at times I've felt almost overly narcissistic as an architect. And the older I get, I think a lot about muting the control that we architects want to have. And I refer to it in the office as assigning authorship to other forces. And so the connections I make with my colleagues are that, is there a way to build that has some degree of predictability, but by assigning other forces or privileging what other forces can do to not only the creation of volume of space, but expression. And one connection we made was when we create a structure that's out of poured in place concrete, instead of these very static forms that resist lateral loads, could the formwork be connected to hinges and rollers and those types of things that add some flexibility? So there's a response when you begin to feel the formwork up with the fluid nature of concrete. Its kind of dynamic movement might shift the forms in a way that take the architecture to a far more beautiful place. And so I like thinking about these things and having these conversations with my colleagues, and it just makes for a much richer and interesting process, but dialogue in the office.
Are you currently in your office right now? Is that
Yeah, we're meeting all the federal guidelines and state guidelines. We're very respectful. We've said to each of our colleagues that, look, if you want to return to the office, as long as we're within the numbers allowed, we support it. But if you feel more safe and secure at in your private dwelling, that works too. I think there's a tremendous amount of good that's going to come out of this. Of course, it's painful for many, and many are dealing with a lot. But I think it's going to kind of rebalance the way we work, as I said. And I think it's going to teach us that some work as well, or maybe even better, from home, and contribute. There are contributions that are unique because of that physical distance, and I think we should embrace that.
What about your actual physical environment when you're there? Do you plan on restructuring it in any way to reduce potential contagion or create a safer office? And how do you deal with, needing to meet certain clients face to face and things like that?
Yeah, we have met with a number of clients face to face, but it's been at a distance with masks. We're careful that we have everything at the front door to take people's temperature and cleaners and those types of things. We're staying a safe distance from each other, and just respectful of personal boundaries, and the importance of thinking of others. And we've published those guidelines in both the New York and New Orleans office, and we're serious about them.
I kind of wanted to take the opportunity now to sort of shift into some of your work a little bit more. Before we started the webinar, we were talking a little bit about this project in Patagonia, and I wanted to know, how did you get so personally invested in the ecology and conservation of that project?
Yeah, this is kind of one of my true loves. This is a pier on a 600-acre farm that we purchased in Patagonia, Chile. This is the Corcovado National Park, and this came about. I was fortunate enough to be invited by a gentleman by the name of Doug Tompkins. For those of you that don't know Doug, Doug grew up in upstate New York. He didn't graduate from high school, but became a pretty decent slalom skier, snow skier. And then at a very young age, started North Face, the clothing company, and then sold it, and then started Esprit. His words, not mine. He decided in his mid to late 40s to rethink his life. And one of the words he stated was he was tired of selling women things they didn't need with Esprit. And when I pressed him on that, he said, well, it's a marketing campaign. You convince people they need things this season and that they're old and outdated at the end of that season, and they have to buy something new and in fashion. And he said, I felt that was not the life I wanted to live. So he sold out of Esprit and he moved to Patagonia, Chile. His wife, Chris Tompkins, was the CEO of Patagonia, the clothing line, with Yvonne Chenard. So two really smart and successful business people. They moved down there, and then over the course of 20 years, they purchased in different ecologies about 2.5 million acres and created 11 national parks. And so about 15 years ago, starting 15 years ago, I would fly down and stay with them at a place called Fundo Rinue, which is in one of their beautiful parks. And Doug and I would get in his 2-seat Husky plane and fly to Andes Mountain. And he would teach me about the uniqueness of these different ecological zones and the importance and life at varying scales. And I just fell in love with this couple and the way they lived and what they privileged, and learned a tremendous amount. One story that I'll share that affected me tremendously was one afternoon, Chris said that they had this beautiful green runway on their land, that a couple was flying in to do another story. They're rock stars in the kind of conservation movement. And that I was staying in their house with them and said they wanted me to join them and the two reporters for dinner that night. And so we're in the rainforest. There are trees outside the house that are called alerce trees that are over 2,000 years old. And the reporter after the wife said, "I'm curious, Doug, what drives a man to give away his entire maybe $1 billion plus fortune to buying lands in 2 foreign countries, Chile and Argentina, and creating 11 national parks?" And his response has impacted me today, in that he leaned back in a very contemplative way and kind of looked down and then raised his head, and he said, I'll ask you in return, what drives a man to die with more than a dime in his pocket when there's so much need and pain and hurt in the world? And that literally almost brought me to my knees. It was so impactful that's how he saw the world. And not that I'll ever become as great as this man was, but it was insight to a person that really cared about life at all scales and taught me about the importance of life at all scales. And so I think about it a lot as it relates to architecture.
It's really beautiful, Trey. Thank you for sharing that. I think I read in when Lauren was introducing you that you also live there. Is your
Yeah,
home?
it's a small 600-acre farm. We have a little green runway. It seems pretentious, but it's really, there's a caretaker house, a Chilean man and his companion live there and kind of maintain the property. And there's but we'll take a float plane and land in this bay. And as mentioned previously, this is where the orcas come in South America. And so it's not rare in August to hear the blow of a massive orca 50 feet from the edge of this pier, and a pod in this area. And it's just magical. The sea lions and the swans and on and on. It's just incredible the amount of life there.
Sounds magical. How many weeks or months out of the year would you say you spend there?
Typically, we'll travel down 3 or 4 times a year. We always leave the day after Christmas and stay through the end of the first week in January. That's the summer months there, and so it's really beautiful. The average temperature on the site is probably in the low to mid 60s. So 2 or 3, 4 times a year for around 10 days a trip. But it's the beauty of it is the cell phone doesn't work there, and so it's total removal. And I didn't realize that this when I purchased it, but it contributes to just a calming effect for me in life when even when I'm not there, because just knowing it's there to retreat to. The closest human intervention is 25 miles. The closest road is 20-something miles. And so you arrive here either on a small plane or boat. And so it's total removal from society.
Wow, that's fantastic. I hope to get there one day.
Yeah.
So your practice began in around 1992, I believe, and I'm curious sort of the broad breadth of all of this, how it sort of evolved from where you started to where you are now. If you could speak to kind of that evolution.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. I think we all start off with a certain set of influencers, right? Existing context, culture of place. At least we did a predetermined list of influences of the work, and it's not that that's not enough, because I think it is. But for me, at a certain point, there was an emptiness about there had to be much more, and once again, I'm almost apologetic that it took me so long to realize. I knew we were designing for people, but our process was devoid of really interrogating the history of people on a site, and the art, or specifically the soil. And so when we started in Patagonia, because we've master planned that site and worked with ecologists and landscape architects. In fact, Reed Hildebrand won a National AIA Award for our work there. I realized that watershed and the flora and fauna that is unique to that watershed was important and relevant to architecture. But I also realized that unique soils result in certain opportunities as it relates to what can be extracted from that flora. For example, the flora, and I'll return to Japan, of the yurishi tree, which produces yurishi, or lacquer, and how important lacquer is to that culture, and the artwork that can come out of the yurishi tree, or the certain clays in regions, and how the ceramicist Shiro Tsuchimura or the famous Raku family create these beautiful ceramics as a result of that clay and the unique clay, and how it results in these unique artifacts. And so the object here is actually a piece made by the artist office, one of the young architects. And that came about in that I collected a few of Geta Izuzuka's pieces. They're these beautiful lacquered pieces. His work is informed by, he saw this really aged Japanese woman leaving a grocery store, and in her hand was a bag, a mesh bag, you know, those mesh bags of oranges. And he watched how these spheres kind of alternated and shift as she walked down the street. And he's become a good friend. He said he followed her, literally fearful that she was fucking maybe stalking her. So he takes a very discardable object, styrofoam balls, and puts them in a mesh bag. These things are at times 3 feet tall. And he allows them to shift and move. And then he applies 20 to 30 layers of lacquer. And they're these stunningly artistic objects at varying scales. He had the V&A, the curator of Asian art, the V&A saw one of his first ones at an art fair in London and bought it immediately. And it's in the V&A. And then a guy named Matthew Hall with Erskine Hall and Co. in London, a gallery picked up on it, had his first show 2 years ago, and literally all of the 21 of his first objects sold within a few days, which was really an expedient sale. But so one of the architects in the office, I purchased a few, brought them into the office, and that coupled with some of Shiro Tsuchimura's spheres excited him about the way spheres interact in a box. And so he placed at times water-filled balloons, so to speak, and air-filled balloons in a framework, and then poured concrete around them. And they created this structure. And then the firm hired him to create approximately 10 to 15 more. And we are using those to inform the way we think about Loyola's chapel. So for us, it's kind of reorganizing the dome in a historic church structure into something that is more abstract and less crucifix form, but brings a high level of mystery to the experience of a building with those types of sacred qualities. So I hope I'm making connections between our passion and love for art and how it informs our work.
Absolutely. I'm curious how the Catholic Church has received that sort of abstract thought and thinking, and how receptive they are to that.
I think it's fair to say that at first, well, I think the beauty of the client is with Jesuits. The word discernment is really important to the Jesuit priest order. And so discernment, as I understand it, is to remain quiet and reflective until you've processed something and arrived at a place of real conviction, but with real basis and information. And so I think we've benefited from that position of discernment, and that they've remained quiet and studied and allowed us to do what I think we've gotten pretty proficient at, and that is taking clients on a journey of revealing either through physical models or digital models that there's hopefully real intelligent thought behind the work, and that it's not shaping or making without depth and richness. And so recently we presented the work and we used some pretty incredible light programs to show them not only how the collision of these domes created the Second Pisces, two interpenetrating circles, which has the symbolism of the Virgin Mary and the fish and those things, but that the way light penetrates the space, almost as if the light carved the space, penetrates a series of apertures on certain important church calendar days, Pentecost Sunday, and how it enters certain spaces uniquely on those days, adding a layer of meaning and richness that impacts not only an individual in those spaces and the processional aspect of moving into these spaces, but also departing, but also community.
And that project is currently in the design phases?
It's, we just received schematic design approval, and we are working through with an extended team of acousticians and light designers, structural engineers through design development.
And it'll be on Loyola University's campus. I'm anxious to see it. It sounds like it's going to be an amazing space.
That's correct. It's going to be adjacent to the Palm Court.
Okay, great. I also wanted to touch back on what you were talking about the flora and the microclimates in Chile. And if you haven't already read it, you may want to check out the book, The Sixth Extinction. It talks about different extinction periods over time. And it spoke to me because they talk about microclimates in Peru specifically. And I had the opportunity to travel there last year, I guess, and go to Machu Picchu. And they talk a lot about how specific microclimates are these very small areas, and whole species of plants and animals can live in an area, and then 20 feet away, they don't exist anymore. And it's just so amazing to me as well. And I loved hearing you speak about that because I have a big interest in it as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I've never been to Machu Picchu. We obviously fly over it every time we go down, and we talk about visiting. So hopefully we'll make it there. To kind of build on what you're talking about, we're exploring that in Chile, how we can increase biodiversity on the site. And the ecologists are teaching us that of how there are ways to edit parts of the temperate rainforest and increase the bees. And we're studying how when we increase the bees, we increase the birds. But we're also learning how there are distances that certain species will travel. We're exploring something with David Vanderleer, who used to be the CEO, head of the Van Allen Institute in New York. We're exploring the possibility of using the site to bring world leaders there to teach them through art about the importance of climate change. And one idea we're exploring right now is can we commission some artwork that is on one level, of course, from the physical expression, really beautiful, but probably more importantly, mandating that that the artwork must either measure biodiversity or increase biodiversity or measure climate change. And so there's a performative aspect to it. And so we're trying to merge these interests into explorations that contribute in multiple ways to other complex issues that the world's dealing with.
Thank you. That's important work. I appreciate you doing that for our profession. We talked a little bit about COVID-19 crisis, but I also wanted to touch on Black Lives Matter and how have both Black Lives Matter and the COVID-19 crisis altered your thinking about architecture, and how do you believe it will change the future design of architecture in New Orleans and the country and maybe even in Chile?
Yeah. Well, I think with all of us, the Black Lives Matter movement has strengthened our resolve, right, to address social and racial justice issues. I mean, we're in the South. We have an intimate knowledge about the complexity of race relations. I have to believe that architecture can play an important role in addressing some of these issues. We are having discussions with a consultant group in California about helping us better understand what has taken place on many of the plantation sites in Louisiana as it relates to slavery, and maybe even obtaining information from the National Archives about specific slaves on specific sites. And I think that our interest is broad there. We want to better understand how plantation life influenced capitalism in the South and US, how it affects maybe urban planning, plantation life, how it affects the way we think about materiality and build in spaces. There's a conflict there in my mind, quite frankly, because I've, for the past 20 years, traveled the state looking at our beautiful plantations and in one way, celebrating the physical expression, the beauty of these bricks, but like there's a horrific conflict there. How do you celebrate on one level the physical beauty of a place when it was born out of atrocities that were at the expense of our African American friends and community on another level, and there's forms of slavery I believe that even exist today. If what I read is correct, that that at many of the penitentiaries, that a lot of the inmates are paid literally pennies an hour for work that is charged to the institution for many dollars. And so for my generation, this is I think something that we need to address and become leaders in. And I hope that the firm can to reside in architecture and not discount architecture in any way, but maybe wake up daily and think about being humanitarians first. And from that perspective, what type of architect can we be? As it relates to the pandemic, the image on the screen is the North American Pavilion, Bonsai Pavilion at the National Arboretum in DC. And this is speaking to some of the issues of, I think, blurring this distinction between conditioned and non-conditioned space, or what I believe what is rich and meaningful about New Orleans and Louisiana architecture, that is degrees of outsidedness, where you're not distinctly internal or external, but we kind of blur those lines and find levels of comfort by creating apertures that respond to prevailing breezes and things like that. And so I'm excited about thinking about bringing more unique external or semi-conditioned spaces internal to the external envelope, and then not feeling like an appendage or something that was an afterthought or applied later.
And so how do you see architecture then evolving in general over the next several years, and with this in light, of where we are in the world?
Yeah, I think we'll work really hard. I think society and I think architects will become more involved in responding to elevating the dignity of the marginalized people. It's pervasive, right? It's throughout the world. You can read a lot about Native American women and the atrocities that were imposed on them in the US. You can read a lot about the residential project in Canada and how the indigenous people there were led to believe that culturally their history was inferior. And I think as architects, we need to be at the tip of the spear and not be responding, but involved early on in yearning for deep knowledge and understanding about those marginalized groups and the important contributions they make to the quality of those of us that are more privileged, and how we can contribute to the quality of their lives. I mean, if you think about New Orleans specifically, our hotel, motel, and restaurant industry, the pain it's going through, but all the workers that make that happen for all of us, for the hospitality industry, the tourist industry. And since I live downtown, I occasionally run into one and engage them in conversation as I enjoy it. And I learn their stories. And one young man told me once about how he has to wake up at 4:30 in the morning to catch a bus to be downtown, and how they leave their daughter, and how expensive that is, just in dealing with these complex issues. And I'm just at this age in my career, I enjoy thinking about that, but doing more than thinking, really challenging myself and the firm to act and to contribute in equally meaningful ways as we do as architects.
Yeah, you spoke a little bit about the prison labor, and I don't know if you had a chance to watch the Netflix sort of documentary called 13th Amendment, but that one's really great. It sort of talks about the broad history of systemic racism from slavery all the way to where we are today. And as architects, I completely agree with you. We need to address this issue, and I guess I should take this time to just sort of plug that the AIA New Orleans has started an Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee that's been pretty active this year, and has a book club, and we're going through anti-racism training in the fall, hopefully. And if anybody who's on this webinar wants to join, we welcome that and encourage it. So that sort of wraps up my questions that I had outlined for you, Trey, and I wanted to keep the last few minutes open for any of the participants if they have any questions that they want to put in the chat or the Q&A section that we could address. And then I'll kind of hand over to Lauren to sort of lead that. So thank you so much, Trey. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Julie. Really appreciate your time and interest.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julie. If anybody has any questions, like we said before, feel free to enter into the chat box or use the Q&A box. Sometimes it does take a few minutes for people to process and enter questions in. So Trey, if you have any other things you would like to remark upon, feel free.
I just thank everyone for attending. I hope I shared something that's unique and interesting about our practice and the way we're searching to contribute in our community. And if there are any follow-up questions or other ways we can contribute, please let us know. We enjoy being here and just finding to be a remarkable city. So I thank each of you for listening in.
We should also congratulate you for being rated the #1 design firm. It's so exciting to have such great architects in our local community. So congrats on that.
Well, thank you. I think my role has been hiring really talented people and being fortunate enough to work with really talented consultants and clients that are willing to kind of go on a journey of exploring what we do and celebrating what everyone on this call, I think, loves and is passionate about. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to second those congrats. No questions. We do have a thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say, in true form, us architects are kind of quiet. Nobody's put in any questions, but.
Well, guys, thank y'all so much, and congratulations on the equity that group, and let us know if we can help in other ways. It's something we've privileged in the office, and we want to get more and more involved in as we learn more about this aspect of our lives and communities that we're all struggling with. So thank you very much.
Thank you. We do still have time for questions, so if anybody does have any questions, feel free to share. And I am just going to briefly highlight some of our upcoming events. We have another storytelling session next Friday with Melissa Rome. And then on September 11th and 12th, we have our Design to Change Symposium. It's our design and practice exchange with WIA New Orleans and WIA Austin, and we're really excited about that. That is going to touch a lot on some of the equity, diversity, and inclusion issues that you guys were talking about. And then on October 29th, we have our virtual design award ceremony. So we encourage you guys to go to our website, aianeworleans.org, for more information about all of these. And if you have any questions, you can also always email us. Again, my email is lauren@aianeworleans.org.
Great. Thank you, Laura. Really appreciate your time.
We did have one quick question, Trey. What books are you reading right now?
Well, right now I'm reading a book on church doctrine because of this chapel project. It's about celebrating the liturgy to return to a better understanding of church doctrine and how Vatican II influenced the way we think of sacred spaces. I am also reading a number of books on Shaker furniture. I attended RPI for one summer. There was a class that a group of us from LSU moved up to Troy, New York, and so I've become very interested in Ann Lee and the Shaker furniture, and specifically the tilter chairs, which had these unique balls embedded on the back legs of the chair, and how that was unique to them. But there's also a book that I'm just a few pages into it called Race and Modern Architecture, to better understand those complex issues, and just to develop a greater appreciation and respect for race and architecture. So,
great, thanks for sharing.
Looks like we have one more question. This is from Matthew Rivera. As Trahan Architects continues to expand in project typologies and scales, how do you manage client buy-in and engagement when proposing material exploration at larger scales? This notion is typically at odds with the developer's agenda. I ask because I've been so impressed with your firm's ability to forge ahead and create masterful contributions for communities and the profession.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. Well, I'll speak specifically to New Orleans. One project we're kind of interrogating cast iron and its role in New Orleans architecture, and maybe a more contemporary use of that materials. There's a number of precedents. One in London, a beautiful retail store where cast iron was cast into sheets, and so we're looking into the limitations. But it's a way, I guess, our way of selling it. It's, speaking of its historical role here and our interest in finding more contemporary ways of using that material. Some of that comes also from my interest in Japanese art. Part of Japanese art is the use of traditional materials. I mentioned one earlier, Yurishi lacquer, and how lacquer was used in certain ways and how those artists could use it in contemporary ways. I don't know if I think we're really, like all architects, we're really committed to this. At times I wonder if we're stubborn and we're aggressive. I think we kind of speak poetically, and just really talk a lot about these things with clients. I don't find that we have to work as hard to convince them of it. I think we've gotten much better at building a strong narrative, a narrative that has depth, and I think there's in recent years we've been successful at obtaining client buy-in pretty quickly. I don't want to say we're not challenged at times. We a couple of years ago completed, and unfortunately it wasn't built, a hotel design in College Station. The market changed, unfortunately, a hotel. And the way the material of that was shishugi bond, as you all know, charred wood. And we made a connection to it in the West, and the bonfire at Texas A&M. And so we find little things embedded in the uniqueness of community that connects the material choices to that culture of place and the materials of place. And we go as far back as Bussy-Ish here in Louisiana, and the importance of finding materials that are unique and local to place. And as I said, it's gotten much easier.
All right. I don't think we had any other questions come in. So unless something comes in the next 30 seconds, we can wrap it up. Thank you so much again, Trey. Thank you to your entire team. Thank you so much, Julie, for stepping in to interview even in some challenging technological circumstances. And thank you so much to everyone who is in attendance.
Yes, thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Julie. Really appreciate your time and your interest in the work. And I look forward to hearing Melissa Rome and her firm. They do beautiful work. For storytelling next week. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And we hope that everybody stays safe and stays well and has a great weekend.
Yeah. Take care. Bye-bye.